Einstein's political engagement in the United States continues many of the themes that we've already seen present during his European life. He continues to be committed to a broader sense of internationalism. He continues to be very worried about the growth of anti-Semitism and national enthusiasms and racial hatred. But some things begin to change, four in particular. So these four factors, the growth of anti-Semitism into the Holocaust, his concern for the possibility of a good life for African Americans within the United States, the growth of McCarthyism, and the spread of nuclear weapons become dominant forces in Einstein's political engagements after World War II. In this period, after World War II, the House Un-American Activities Committee had witnesses that at various times accused Einstein of various things. One of them was that he had written to the Stalingrad mayor after the Stalingrad defense against the Nazis, and this was somehow seen as too sympathetic to the Russians, even though the Soviets had been American allies during World War II. Einstein had signed a fundraising appeal for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and that was reported to the FBI already in August of 1943. So the FBI became increasingly concerned, and over 1,000 pages of material were gathered on Einstein, desperately trying to figure out his political alliances and fundamentally suspicious of Einstein in his sympathy for African Americans, in his toleration of socialism and some of the positions that were taken by people who were seen to be too sympathetic to the Communist Party, in his view that there should be a transnational government, in his criticism of policy on atomic weapons. In all of these ways, the FBI grew increasingly suspicious. As for Einstein, in the midst of World War II, in May of 1943, he wrote that the necessity of adhering to the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries had to be abandoned when any government asserted the right to conduct a systematic campaign of physical destruction of any segment of the population which resides within its borders. One would truly be doing the peoples of Europe a favor if without any sentimentality one ended the existence of sovereign states. Einstein had become fundamentally convinced that it was impossible to maintain an idea of total national sovereignty if that national sovereignty included genocidal policies. To the General Assembly of the United Nations in October of 1947, Einstein pressed his case that the idea of pure national sovereignty was simply incompatible with atomic weapons. To the United Nations, he said, there can never be complete agreement on international control and the administration of atomic energy, or on general disarmament, until there is a modification of the traditional concept of national sovereignty. For as long as atomic energy and armaments are considered a vital part of national security, no nation will give more than lip service to international treaties. Security, Einstein continued, is indivisible. It can be reached only when necessary guarantees of law and enforcement obtain everywhere, so that military security is no longer the problem of any single state. There is no compromise possible between preparation for war on the one hand and preparation of a world society based on law and order on the other. These concerns about national sovereignty predate, for Einstein, World War II. But nuclear weapons exacerbated the problem beyond all imagination. And Einstein searched out and had his commitments to people that he thought were working towards a kind of equality among people and among nations. He was very sympathetic to Henry Wallace, who had been the vice president in the last of the Roosevelt terms from 1941 to 1945. And in this image, he appears with Henry Wallace and with Paul Robeson, about whom much more in a moment. The FBI took note of this. In fact, they noted that Einstein had invited Wallace home. Wallace was already a lightning rod for conservatives, as he was thought to be far too sympathetic to internationalism and a worry for the future of the country. The FBI file on Einstein continued in 1947. Newark confidential informant advised that almost all Progressive Party candidates for public office in New Jersey are known to him as Communist Party members. The Chicago Star contained a photograph of Einstein with Wallace and Robeson. An accompanying article stated that Einstein had invited Wallace to his New Jersey home and expressed great admiration for Wallace's courage and devotion to the fight for world peace. So the FBI could even put the vice president or the former vice president in its crosshairs when they felt like it. They were extremely suspicious of the athlete, lawyer, civil rights activist, actor Paul Robeson, and they were increasingly concerned by Einstein's left leanings. In 1949, Einstein no doubt exacerbated the FBI's fears when he penned a piece called "Why Socialism?" The crippling of individuals I consider the worst evil of capitalism. Our whole educational system suffers from this evil. An exaggerated competitive attitude is inculcated into the student, who is trained to worship acquisitive success as preparation for his future career. I am convinced, Einstein continued, that the only way to eliminate these great evils is through the establishment of a socialist economy, accompanied by an educational system which would be oriented towards socialist goals. There's a way in which Einstein's critical stance towards racism, discrimination, competitive attitudes in education, and so on, are all quite clear. But what he actually meant by a socialist economy or a socialist-oriented educational system is much less well articulated. But when it comes to the criticism of what was going on in America in the years after World War II, he was quite clear. He took on a variety of causes, and these were not, as some people said, the random musings of a man who'd lost his intellectual power. They were quite systematic, as Einstein sought to defend, especially the discrimination against African Americans. There was a famous case that began in 1931 in Alabama, when 9 African Americans who were riding a train got into a fight with a band of white guys, and this fight then led to the white kids getting knocked off the train. They were fine, but there were 2 white women on the train, and they accused the 9 young black men of having raped them. This became a cause célèbre. It was tried over and over again. Aspects of the case were sent to the Supreme Court. It was a huge battle that resulted in 8 of the 9 being sentenced to die, and a series of appeals and retrials, clear evidence of rigging the jury to get them convicted, discriminating against blacks on the jury. All of this continued throughout the 30s and 40s and was still being debated in the early 1950s. And Einstein came to defend them and to defend the idea that these black men should be exculpated of a crime that pretty clearly they'd never committed. In fact, one of the women said that it had been a lie from the beginning. There was evidence of falsified evidence. The whole thing was really quite a disaster. There were doctors testified in favor of the defense. In any case, this went on. It was one example of Einstein's involvement in civil rights issues. He went on to defend the Civil Rights Congress in 1948, the Defense of Freedom Crusade also in 1948. In fact, it was clear throughout this period, when Einstein joined campaign after campaign, that what brought them together was really a continuation of his sense that the nation-state shouldn't be allowed to discriminate against the populations within its borders. Another case that attracted Einstein's attention was the so-called defense of the Trenton Six. This was, again, a group of African Americans who were accused of killing a New Jersey merchant. They had no good lawyers, they had coerced confessions, 4 of them were exonerated, and Einstein denounced the attempts to keep them from naming their own lawyers. He went on to defend the Southern Conference for Human Welfare in 1950, among whom sponsors Einstein put his name. The Trenton Six were celebrated in a remarkable image by Charles White, the artist, in 1949, and it became something that was discussed quite widely across the United States at this time. Another political case that involved Einstein and that got the attention of many very prominent Americans was the case of Willie McGee, an African American who was accused of having raped a white woman in 1945, a crime that no white had been executed for, but 51 black men had been executed for the crime in the previous years. An all-white jury deliberated for 2.5 minutes and voted for his execution in 1951. In that case, Einstein was joined in protest by Jessica Mitford, William Faulkner, the author, Paul Robeson, and many others. It became something that was widely discussed in magazines and on radio shows all over the country. Einstein was tracked in all of his political interventions by the FBI. They were particularly concerned, for example, with his involvement with W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the first African American to get a doctorate from Harvard, a very prominent sociologist, founder of the NAACP, a tireless advocate for civil rights, and one of the formative voices of the modern civil rights movement. And Einstein, again, formed a close alliance with him. Paul Robeson, I've mentioned before, was one of the most famous actors, advocates for civil rights. He had qualified as a lawyer. He was an extraordinary figure. His singing was celebrated around the world. He was very left in his orientation and became, as time went on, one of the targets of FBI investigation and a lightning rod for criticism from many across the political spectrum, not only from conservatives, but from liberals as well. But Einstein stood by him, and Robeson, after having been invited to Einstein's house on Mercer Street in Princeton, reported on those conversations. "We chatted," he said, "about many things, about peace, for Dr. Einstein is truly a man of peace, about the freedom struggles in South Africa, which interested him keenly, and about the growing shadows being cast over freedom of thought and expression here at home." That would be Einstein's concern about the growing power of McCarthyism. Robeson continued, "Though he is physically frail, one can feel the strength of his spirit and the glowing warmth of his compassion for humanity. There was a note of deep sorrow and concern underlying his comments on what is happening in our land." And Robeson continued, "As he spoke, one could sense something of what this must mean to Einstein, the giant of science and culture, who was driven from his homeland by the Nazi barbarians." Robeson had become famous through his production of Othello in 1943, which he starred in with Uta Hagen. He had gone on to produce records that were widely distributed. And here's a clip from Robeson about his work in Othello.
Shakespeare, the genius that he was, seemed to foreshadow and understand many of the problems that have since arisen in our world, perhaps were present then. First, I would say that here is a part which has dignity for the Negro actor. Often we don't get those opportunities. And I would say that my people will be very proud of my or any other Negro actor appearing in such a part. I think also that to me Othello is one of a different culture. Shakespeare insists that he's African. Some argument whether the word black and the fact that he's from Africa is very clear to me. And that Shakespeare posed this problem of a, say, black man in a white system.
But the criticism of Einstein grew more and more intense. In the early 1950s, a conservative columnist, Jimmy Tarantino, had his polemic against Einstein recorded in the Immigration and Naturalization Service files. Tarantino had written, "Red fronting Einstein should be deported." The Senate Internal Security Committee would most likely discover that Einstein's commie connections have been so wide and vast in scope that it may be safer to deport him to his native Europe. Who needs this Einstein? Not the American people, and that's for sure. Einstein may know what he's talking about, but I'll be darned if I do. And nowhere in those files is there anything about Einstein's contributions to science, his having alerted the president to the possibility of nuclear weapons, to the scope and breadth of the work that he'd conducted over the previous more than half century. And Einstein continued with his involvement with politics, even to the last months and weeks of his life. On the 5th of January 1955, he wrote, "The most important aspect of Israel's policy must be an ever-present manifest desire to institute complete equality for the Arab citizens living in our midst. The attitude we adopt toward the Arab minority will provide the real test of our moral standards as a people." In fact, there was at one stage in 1952 when Einstein was offered the presidency of Israel, and the authorities there were actually quite worried about what they might do if Einstein accepted, which he did not. But it indicated the role that Einstein had, the enormous presence that he had in the world as a figure not only of science, but in the broader world of culture more generally. In 1953, Einstein wrote in the New York Times a very strong argument against intellectuals testifying to the House Un-American Activities Committee. What ought the minority of intellectuals do against this evil? Frankly, I can only see the revolutionary way of non-cooperation in the sense of Gandhi. Every intellectual who is called before the committees ought to refuse to testify, i.e., must be prepared for jail and economic ruin. In short, for the sacrifice of his personal welfare in the interest of the cultural welfare of this country. If enough people are ready to take this grave step, they will be successful. If not, then the intellectuals deserve nothing better than the slavery which is intended for them. These were tough words, and the FBI clearly took note. In the FBI files, you'll see, for example, comments that say, "This memorandum is classified security information, secret," inasmuch as secret information from the section G2 was included. Albert Einstein is the subject of a pending internal security R investigation, where the FBI uses R as their code for Russia. There's still a lot of many of the files that the FBI will not release, as you'll see when you go through the link to the FBI files, and there'll be indication about where they've held back, for instance, a section because it would reveal the name of an informant. But the FBI files become obsessed with certain aspects of Einstein's past. For example, there's a gigantic body of information about Helen Dukas, Einstein's very long-term secretary, who would come to work with him in the late 1920s and stayed with him through his death, and in fact was still the person organizing the papers when I was an undergraduate and I went to work at the Einstein papers to learn more about what Einstein had done. And the idea that this woman who had utterly devoted her life to Einstein was, at the time she was trying to handle his increasing world fame, that she was somehow orchestrating an international communist conspiracy was just crazy. And even in the end, the FBI realized that this investigation was going nowhere. The FBI concluded their case in March of 1955, remarking that their chief informant had produced both reliable and unreliable information, definitively closing the case as they noted that Albert Einstein had died at 1:15 on the 18th of April 1955. It is further to be noted, the file writes, that his death was given wide publication in newspapers and news services throughout the United States, almost as if the FBI were surprised that a country, that a world, would take note of the passing of the greatest scientist of the 20th century.